pass it over.
Okay.
Great.
All right, well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We've got a great group with us, and it looks like from all across Canada, which is fabulous. My name's Jenica Heim, and I'm with Education USA here in Canada. I work out of Ottawa, however, I represent all of you. At the end of the presentation, I have some social media, contact information, my email address. You can always feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about studying in the US. And so just a brief introduction, and I'll let Beth and JJ tell you more about themselves. But we're lucky enough today to have expert presenters from the University of Pennsylvania joining us today to help talk about some of the details on the US applications that can be a little bit confusing, I mean, frankly, for anybody, but they're speaking specifically to you as Canadian students and guidance counselors and parents, just to help understand these applications a bit more. And just by way of introduction, Beth is a Senior Associate Director and JJ is the Associate Director. They're both on the international team in the admissions department at University of Pennsylvania. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and hand it over to them.
Great. Hi, welcome everybody.
Hello, hello.
So JJ and I are really excited to kind of be here with you this afternoon. The two of us, JJ will tell you more about our backgrounds, but the two of us have worked with Canadian students and counselors and families for the past 2 years, and I think we've both seen how this can be a more challenging process for students coming from Canada. As Jenica said, this is a complicated enough process for American students, so you cross that border, and I think it can become even more confusing, but we're here to demystify this today. So why don't we just introduce you to what it is we're going to be talking about. JJ will offer some introductions for the two of us. We'll also just briefly introduce you to the University of Pennsylvania, which is obviously the school we work for, but that is not the point of today's presentation. We really want to help you understand why students would want to study in the United States, how it is we go about crafting our classes, how we go about the admissions process. So that's both from a philosophical perspective. We'll be talking about holistic admission, what that means to us, how we're looking at the entire student, not just his or her performance inside of the classroom, but his or her interests and passions outside of it as well, and how that can contribute to our universities. Then we'll get more into the nitty-gritty, which is how students go about applying. We can offer some tips for that, how it is we're viewing those documents, along with all of those fun decision plans we have here in America, like early decision and early action restricted choice. We'll give you a vocabulary lesson, so to speak. And then we'll certainly talk about the affordability, the cost, the financial aid that can come along with studying in America. Now, JJ and I will be on the screen for the first couple of slides. Then we'll flip off so you can really focus in on the slides, but also pose any questions to us over the chat feature, and we can respond as we go. And we're also happy to pause at the end to answer any additional questions you may have. All right, let's get rolling.
Yeah, so Beth and I come with 17 years experience on highly selective admissions. So Beth and I have both worked at the University of Pennsylvania and other colleges here in the US. And we've recruited students all around the globe. And we've evaluated tens of thousands of applications. And we are the candidate team for the University of Pennsylvania. And since we have so many Canadian students applying to Penn and then ultimately enrolling at Penn, our admissions office sees the need to have two folks represent the country. So we split it west and east. And east for us is Ontario out east, and then west is going to be Manitoba out west. So we do a lot of work traveling out through those areas, meeting with counselors and students, doing joint travel programs with other schools in the Ivy League that we're a part of. And ultimately, it's a lot of counseling, advising to make sure that Canadian students have the requirements of that application process so that they have everything complete so that they can be considered in our evaluation process. And we work very closely with the Canadian students here at Penn. We're actually doing a phone-a-thon tomorrow night with our Canadian club here, where the current students at Penn are reaching out via phone to the admitted students that are from Canada. So it's nice to see that kind of community here at Penn. It really informs the work that we do in the admissions process, which we hope to share with you here today.
So just for context, we are coming to you virtually from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania today. You may think when you hear the University of Pennsylvania that that is a state-affiliated school or a publicly funded institution, but it's actually not. We are a private four-year institution that is a part of the Ivy League. In fact, JJ and I travel with other Ivy League institutions, so Harvard, Yale, Princeton, as well as what we call Ivy Plus schools like MIT and Stanford. We travel to Canada each year. Gosh, in this past cycle, I was in Ottawa and Montreal and Toronto. Surprised I didn't see anybody sign in from Toronto yet. Maybe they just haven't revealed themselves. And JJ also traveled extensively out west. Okay, there we go. We have somebody. Great, welcome. So we travel extensively with our peer institutions to share the message of what a Penn education can provide. We were founded, don't worry, this is not going to be a history lesson, but we were founded by Benjamin Franklin with the concept that we would provide students with a liberal arts and sciences education, so that's integral to all of our undergraduate schools, which I'll talk more about, while also providing students with hands-on practical education that readies them for careers. So when you look at our undergraduate population, we have students who are studying in our College of Arts and Sciences, which is really the intellectual heart and soul of our campus. We also have students enrolled in the Wharton School of Business, in the School of Engineering and Applied Science, and our nursing school. In addition to that, because we believe in interdisciplinary learning, there's lots of ways for students to jump into specialized programs where they're studying across the 4 different undergraduate schools, and they're looking at the world through a host of different academic lenses. So blending engineering and business, or blending liberal arts and sciences with nursing. We don't just do a deep dive into a particular major. We want students to have that depth, but also have breadth across the spectrum of liberal arts and sciences and pre-professional studies. As JJ mentioned, we have a very large Canadian student population. Overall, our international population is about 14% of our undergraduate student body. And after Americans in that class, or I should say United States citizens in the class, Canada comes in as our second most represented country. So that's another reason why we're excited to be talking to you. What's a real differentiator, and this is when I'll start to be quiet about Penn, but the real differentiator for Canadian students when applying to Penn is that we're need blind in our admissions practice. So we don't know if your students require aid or not, and we'll meet their full demonstrated need 100% for all 4 years through their use of grant money. So to boil this all down, Canadian citizens and permanent residents are treated exactly the same way in our process as United States citizens and permanent residents are. But you're not here just to learn about Penn. You're here to really dive into how to apply to schools in America. So I think we're going to turn our camera off now, and we'll start to dive into the slides.
All right, let's see if we can do that here. Let's see. I don't know if I know how to do that, actually. I know we did it yesterday in our trial, but let's see. Are you okay just leaving it on? I don't want to, like, close this out.
Jenica, could you tell us how to turn the camera off? Technical difficulty.
Bam, there we go. Okay, so thinking about applying to U.S. universities, you have to really think about just how there are so many institutions of higher learning in the United States versus Canada. And one thing that really separates us coming from that the U.S. perspective is just a tradition of the liberal arts. And Beth touched on that when talking about Penn. And that's because you want to have the ability to study across disciplines instead of just choosing one specialty like you would in Canada with the faculty. So that's where you really start to see the tradition of the liberal arts start to come to be, where you have students that take classes in physics, take classes in English, and have that be the same student working towards that holistic education. And the flexibility really comes through in the U.S. university programs because you have that freedom to explore across the breadth of the entire universities. Where, as an example here at Penn, as Beth mentioned, if you are going to be in the School of Nursing, you can take classes in the College of Arts and Sciences. Or if you're in an engineering curriculum, you have the ability to take classes in a foreign language. So you're not pigeonholed into that one academic track. And in the US, we do have those majors that allow you to specialize later on in your careers, your educational careers, which you can then use to go on to grad school. Or you can just take your major, go off, and have it align with an employer that would want you in the job field. So liberal arts really allows you to have that informed, broad perspective that helps you with your specialty. And then it looks like, and definitely if you have the hand raised, we're noticing the questions along the right, so we can talk about those as well. In thinking about the campus resources that are available in the United States, there, as mentioned in the above point about tradition, we've been around for a long time throughout, thinking about Harvard going back to the 1600s and Penn to the 1700s. So we've been able to invent ourselves each century with what we need to have in the job fields. So there are internships that plug into medicine and pharmaceuticals. There's research that plugs into urban studies. There are activities like sports. Penn's a Division I NCAA school, and there's going to be a lot of your students that are going to be interested in not only our athletics, but athletics at other schools. We have career advisors, academic advisors that work with the students to make sure that their liberal arts, broad-based education will still be applicable out there in the job force. And then a lot of us, because we've been around for such a long time, have just global alumni networks. And I'm thinking about when Beth and I travel out to our parts of Canada, how we meet with alumni in Vancouver, how we meet with alumni in Toronto, how we have interviews conducted in Calgary and Saskatoon. So we're able to really have that reach, not only within Canada as Penn alumni, but if we were to travel to India or Japan or China or wherever, we're going to have those alumni networks because we have that tradition of alumni being engaged with our universities.
So I guess 2 years ago, I was at that NACAC conference in Toronto, perhaps a bunch of you were as well, and there was a great session on what's the difference between American institutions of higher learning and Canadian institutions of higher learning. And I think what was most shocking to me was just the sheer number of schools in America versus Canada and the range of private schools that we have here. So that's really going to inform why we're so interested in fit when we're looking at a student's application. And I'm going to circle back to that momentarily. The other thing that struck me when I was meeting with some representatives from Canadian universities is just how much they can drill into a student's senior year level grades, or grade 12 grades, forgive me, I'm being very US in that approach, grade 12 results and say yes or no to whether or not they're going to accept a student. For the most part, surely out of 3,000 colleges and universities, you can find some exceptions to this in the US, but largely we're going to be interested in a student's entire record from grade 9 through grade 12. We also very much have the practice in America of looking at standardized testing, such as the SAT and the ACT. And we know that that's not a part of the Canadian tradition. And when we drill more into the logistics of how we review an application, we will certainly reassure you there that the way we're looking at how a Canadian tests versus how a US student test is going to be different, because here there's a cottage industry of test prep centers and review books and preparing for this from the 5th grade or what have you, whereas that just doesn't exist where you all are. So we're going to take that all into account. To get back to this idea of fit, and JJ was already talking about this, as much as we're evaluating a student's academic readiness for our institution, we're also interested in how they're going to contribute extracurricularly to the life of the school in terms of performing arts and sports and writing activities and service engagement. So we're leaning on recommendation letters that a student submits, his or her resume, to really get a sense of who else is this student. Yes, they're academically prepared for our institution, but what else are they going to add to us? The final piece that we're all evaluating, because we know students can apply to hundreds and thousands of schools across America, although we would tell them not to do that, is we're concerned with their fit for our institution. Do they understand what this school is about? Is it a good fit for their interests? So I always like to give an example here of an essay I read a number of years ago about a student's passion to come to Penn to study aerospace engineering. And it was a beautifully crafted essay, and I want to do aerospace engineering. I want to be an astronaut. And at the end, I recommended that we deny the student because we do not have an exclusive aerospace engineering major. So it was not a good fit. So we're looking for this academic preparation across the whole span of high school. We're looking for those personal qualities, those extracurricular activities, talents, passions, interests that a student will contribute. And then we're also thinking about the personality of our institution and whether or not a student is a good fit for that.
Yeah, so in seeing that we have Jonathan's question there, so for the way that we, at least Penn, does things, and seeing that you are a permanent resident of Canada and hold a non-American foreign passport, you would be viewed based on the secondary school that you're applying from. So the way that we do our admissions is that if you are applying from a school in Calgary, we'll view you as a student from Calgary, even if you are, let's say, a citizen of Sweden. So any person that goes to school in Canada will be considered based on the high school that they're applying from. So in thinking about that holistic admissions advice that we can give you, and at least kind of just discuss a lot about what holistic admissions is, it's important to realize that if you are yourself, if you are being yourself, then we as universities get to learn most about you. And what we try to do is find the best match, as Beth said. So that goes into that fit concept. And if you look at a lot of the research out there, I'm thinking of Dr. Hawksby's higher education economics, where you start to see that not only is the student getting a university, but the university is getting a student. So it's really this two-way proposition, or this two-way exchange, where you want to have the student come to a college and thrive, and you want to have a college be able to find students that will then thrive on their campus. So there's really no formula, and when we go out to our travel experiences in Canada, we get that question a lot from the students and especially the parents, and they want to know what weight is placed on the GPA in the formula, or what activities are seen as more valuable in the formula, or what should I write my essay about so that I can get an A in the formula. There really isn't a formula, because you want to have all of the components of an application come together. And the way that I generally think about this is that your application is like a storybook, and you as the applicant are the main character of the story. So if you're being yourself within that story, then your main character or your story is being developed across all parts of that application. So we want to find your voice that we will then add to our class. And thinking about where you're coming from, going back to that, how we evaluate candidates, universities are going to know that you are applying from Canada. And many US universities, especially if they're like Penn, will have a history of applicants applying either from your school specifically or your province. So they'll understand the provincial requirements, they'll understand that some secondary schools will have AP classes or IB classes. They're going to know, based on the school profile that the guidance counselor gives us or the history of applicants, how that school grades. So we're going to be able to understand what's available to you, and then we evaluate your application based off of that information in front of us. We can only evaluate you within the context that surrounds you. And remember that it does take a community to make you as a student get to university. You're going to have parents that help drive you from activities to activities. We ask for letters of recommendation, so teachers and university counselors are going to be there supporting you in this process. So it's important to make sure that they are going to be proud representatives for you. So make sure that you are, going to class on time, that you're doing your homework and turning it in on time, you're doing it at a high level. So when those people representing you sit down to support you, they're doing it in a way that when we read applications is a way that supports you and doesn't hinder you. And you need to have all this community or all this story come together, because in those committee conversations where Beth and I sit down with the chairperson that's going to be the one deciding whether or not to accept you to our university, we ask questions like, what kind of impact will this student have on campus? Will this student thrive academically on our campus? We want you as a student, again, to fit with our college and for our college to fit with you. And that's why it all comes together within the application, and that's why we have all these parts of the application that we then evaluate to see your personal story.
So there are a lot of questions rolling in, which is really, really exciting. And I think a lot of them are circling around who reads that application, which is a great way to start this off with, how do I apply? The application is going to be reviewed by whoever manages the territory of the secondary school you're enrolled in. So Christine, I see you asked a question, for instance, if you have an American citizen who's at Ashbury College for all 4 years, it's going to be actually me who reads the file, because I read students who attend school in Ontario. If a student has gone to school, let's say, in Ontario and then heads to British Columbia for 2 years, JJ and I are both going to take a look at that file. I'll give him the context of what happened in that student's record in Ontario, and then he'll be able to weigh in on what's happening for them in British Columbia. And this really underscores that point of context is key for us. It's looking at the student within the secondary school or schools he or she has attended, and has he or she thrived and maximized the opportunities within that particular environment. The only time, and we'll talk more about this as we move on, but really passports and citizenship and permanent residency is only going to matter when we're talking about aid, when we're talking about financial aid. And a question just popped in, how would we know if a U.S. citizen lives in British Columbia? On any of these applications, if you take a look at my first bullet point, whether it's the common application, the universal application, or an institution's own application, we're going to ask what the student's citizenship is, or multiple citizenships. We have students who hold multiple passports applying to Penn. So you don't have to worry about communicating that to us. And again, it's really only going to matter when we're talking about aid dollars. For instance, if we have students applying from Brazil, U.S. federal aid dollars can't fund that student, naturally. So that's when it's going to matter, not in terms of who's necessarily reading the file and what pool they're in. That's based on secondary school. All right, so let's just review. So naturally, in America, a school could have its own application. Increasingly, you're seeing schools migrate to the common application. And just as a refresher, or if you're not familiar with it, the common application allows students to jump in and fill out their name once, their activities once, create one essay for schools. It's a much more streamlined approach. And then that student can take all of that information on that application and filter it out to one of the 500 or so institutions that subscribe to the common application. For instance, Penn's one of them. And Stanford is, and I think Duke is, and Harvard is. So students could take that one application and send it to Penn and Duke and Harvard and Stanford and it's all the same information. Likewise, it's a streamlined process for all of you. You only have to fill out that secondary school report, for instance, once, and then filter it out to the schools that subscribe to the common application. The universal application is exactly that same type of process. And there can be some overlap between common application schools and universal application schools. I think what's true for any institution in the U.S. is that first and foremost, we are interested in how a student has performed inside of your classrooms. So day in and day out, since ninth grade, since grade 9, all the way through grade 12. That indicates to us, how does this student work on a day-to-day basis? How has he or she challenged himself in terms of the rigor? And that's rigor that's available at your school. We can't expect students to do any more than that. If your school, for instance, is an international baccalaureate school, it would be fantastic for us to see students stretching to take those courses. If your school doesn't offer that, if you are following along with prescriptive classes for the provincial requirements, that's all we can ask students to do. So we want to see them challenging themselves based on your program. And naturally, we want to see students doing well within that context. I'm seeing out of the corner of my eye, JJ's replying to questions, but I'm seeing a lot about GPAs. And we know that the grading system is different in Canada. We are prepared for that. And guess what? Penn's just not prepared for that. Schools all across the country are prepared to handle that. We know that your GPA doesn't mean the same thing as a GPA in Pennsylvania or a GPA in Brazil or a GPA in California. Context, context, context is key. Something that some of you send along with your applications and some of you don't send along with your applications is a school profile. And I know JJ and I would both be happy to talk offline if you have questions about a school profile. This is a way for you to indicate to schools, be it in Canada, the US, or abroad, who may not be familiar with your particular high school. You can indicate to us, what's the community like? Who goes to school at XYZ high school? Is it a community where most students are first generation to college? Is it a community where students had to test into that particular high school? Is it a community that has an IB program or has an AP program? You can just set the stage for us. If we have questions, we're always going to contact you to get more clarity. But if you can share this information with us in your school profile, kind of the cheat sheet of the highlights of your school, that's really, really helpful. You'll notice, I'm going to point this out, that we didn't lead off with standardized testing, right? Standardized testing is one part of the process. We are much more inclined to act affirmatively on students who have very strong high school transcripts and more average in any given school's pool, standardized testing, than we are to respond to a student who has a lackluster transcript and excellent standardized test scores. We know that for your students, standardized testing is not a regular part of the process. They have to take it. It's a way that we can compare students across an international applicant pool. Get a sense of how they're performing relative to peers around the world. But it is indicative of only a couple of Saturdays out of their lives. This should not be an extracurricular activity where they sharpen their pencil and go off to take the test each week. One part of the process that informs our decision but doesn't necessarily drive our decision. The other piece that's really helpful when we're looking at students for their academic fit with their institution is not just what classes have they taken, what have they earned in those classes, what do the faculty members, what do you as their counselor have to say about that individual student? This is really, really helpful commentary. And again, JJ and I are happy to have offline conversations about what makes an effective recommendation letter. Essentially, though, if I can distill this, an effective recommendation letter speaks specifically about that student. As a counselor, you would want to share with us, what has that student achieved in your particular school, academically, socially, extracurricularly? Maybe you want to share with us extenuating circumstances that the students had. Maybe he developed mono in grade 10 and his grades took a dip. Tell us that. If we're left to our own devices, right, JJ, we're going to assume the worst. But if you share with us all of this background information, we again have that context to make effective decisions. In terms of your teachers, as they're writing letters for your students, the keys I would advise them to keep in mind are to write specifically about that student, write about how that student performed in his or her class. They don't have to cover the whole student the way you are in that counselor letter. They don't need to talk about extracurricular activities. They don't need to necessarily talk about personal qualities or how the student did in biology, even though they're the English teacher. We want to hear exactly what's happening in that particular classroom. What would that classroom have been like if the student had been absent for a day? What would that classroom have been like if he hadn't been there? What would the other students have done? Was their go-to person not there to help them figure out the problem set? Or did you not have someone readily raising their hand? Those recommendation letters can help bring that student, that real student, to life. Now, all of us in America, JJ, I'll handle resume and then I'll shift off to you. We'll divide this list. When we're looking at the resume, what has a student accomplished outside of the classroom? That's important to us. Most of our institutions in the U.S. are going to be living, learning communities. So the residential environments, how are students going to contribute to the rich extracurricular life on our campuses? Well, we gauge that based off of what have they been involved with on a secondary school level. Here the key is quality, not quantity. So a student could be involved in 2 or 3 activities and do them meaningfully, rise to leadership positions, earn awards on that debate team, and that can resonate with us. Then we know a student is going to come and dive into our environment. Other students may be involved in a bunch of different activities, and that's okay too. But we want to see meaningful engagement in these endeavors, to know they're going to come to Penn and get involved here. We'll see students who are well-rounded, students who have a performing art and a sport, and they do community service. Likewise, we'll see students who are well lopsided. Maybe students who are fantastic musicians, and they do music 30 hours a week, and that's all they do. That's just as great as well. It's looking for, what is that student passionate about? What are they excited by? And how would that enrich our particular environment?
Yeah, so, and then turning to kind of the remaining parts of the application here, the essays are going to be critical as we put that story together about who you are or what voice you'll bring to campus. So thinking about the personal statements in the Common Application, that's what it's called. And as Jenica makes a great point here along in the chat, that some universities or colleges may not see as many Canadian students applying or may just have different questions that you may have to ask. So it's important to see what those universities are asking of you, and that in these essay prompts, you answer the question. We, a lot of times in our committee conversations, will see a university-specific essay to Penn that talks about another university, which doesn't help us answer questions that are Penn-specific. So if you think about maybe a short answer that's geared toward another college or university, it's important to take, even if your themes are similar, because you want the same thing from that school, you have to make sure that you're tweaking or catering your answer to each school, especially when you think about places like Penn that have a lot of students that we unfortunately deny. This is where you start to see students distinguishing themselves, because you see students that have taken the time to learn more about this specific university that you're applying from. In the last piece, you see that there are possible interviews. I mentioned that Penn has alumni interviewers throughout the country of Canada. And there are going to be some schools that require interviews from their applicant pool, so they may be virtual. Penn does not require an interview, but we try to have an interview available to everyone in our pool. And there are going to be some schools that you're applying to that as a part of their process may actually require that you have an on-campus interview. So it's important to look at the different schools' websites to which you are applying so that you understand how they may view this interview portion of an application. We at Penn, knowing that we have a global student body with applicants from all around the world, we have that be alumni in your local community or virtually through Skype, because we want it to be as open and accessible for you as an applicant. So now turning our attention to how you can apply. In the US, there are a lot of different programs that you can choose from. And the way that we do things at Penn is the first program you see listed there, and that's early decision. And that's going to be a binding admission with a contract that you sign on your application that says, if I am accepted to your university, then I will come to your university. So you can think about early decision as both you already have made a decision, and Penn, or the early decision school, making a decision on your application, and then that match or that marriage being a contract that comes together if you are accepted. Traditionally, you see early decision or early decision 2 or early action programs having deadlines in December. Some are in January, and usually you see types of decisions of admit, defer, or deny. And defer is going to be when you basically have your application passed into the regular round. But to define the other parts of the application or programs in that early round, you see the early decision, which is what Penn does. There are some US universities that do early decision 2, and this is after the early decision round of decisions go out. There are some universities that come in and offer you a second window of binding admission, which could be, say, an application deadline of January 15th, where they want to have you bound to come within that second window if you didn't get into your first choice school. And then there's early action, and early action is when you have a non-binding application to a university where you're just simply asking the university to do a decision or to have an action done on your file. And there you can see, again, an admit, defer, or deny. And a lot of schools use early action to just give you that decision early so you know that you have an acceptance in your back pocket. And then there are some schools that do single choice or restricted early action. And again, this is non-binding. This is a non-binding application. But in some cases, this restriction or this single choice is where the university asks that you only apply to their school early. So they'll say, please apply just to us in the early round. We'll give you an admission decision. And if it's positive, if you are accepted, you don't have to come, but then you at least know before anything else. And it's important to read up on what school you're looking at's early program is, because there are these different nuances across these 4 different programs. Now, the bulk of applicants in US university admissions are done through regular decision programs or regular action programs. And traditionally, you see deadlines in December, some in January, some go into the February month, and decisions traditionally arrive in March or April. We actually just released ours here on March 31st. And this is where you see those types of decisions of admit, deny, or waitlist. And you can imagine that in unison or in concert with an early program, how schools start to build their class based on their applicant pool. So if you're thinking of a place like Penn that does an early decision binding program, Penn actually took 54% of our class through that early decision round. And then you see in the regular round, about 31,000 more people applied for the fewer spaces that are left, and that's where you start to see an application acceptance rate go way down. And that's because you see such restriction placed from the early decision class having already been accepted and they're bound to come, and then having the regular action pool be so large. So it's important to understand how these 2 different programs of early and or regular may affect your application to US university, because maybe you're looking at a school that has an early program that may benefit you and you haven't completed an SAT or ACT testing requirement, and that pushes you off into the regular round. That means that you may not get the statistical advantages of an early program, and it may mean that you're in heavier competition with those in a regular program. Now, some U.S. universities look at rolling admissions or have rolling admissions programs, which generally these are public universities here in the States where you apply and they'll say as the admissions office, okay, in 2 weeks you'll get a decision from us as we get your application. But it's important with these rolling admissions programs to make sure that the program you're applying to doesn't fill up, because in some cases it may be a small specialty program that only has 50 slots, let's say, and they accept as they get applications. And if you apply too late to a rolling program, then you may have missed the opportunity to go into that specialty program. And again, you'll often see these decisions coming out on that rolling, ongoing basis. And you can see, again, the admit, waitlist, or deny decisions here. So there are lots of different ways that you can apply to U.S. universities. It's important to understand the different rounds that are available to you and how some are binding, some are not binding, and then how financial aid may play into that down the road.
All right, let's talk money, right? One piece of studying in America is that it can be maybe more expensive.
Yes, indeed.
But maybe not. And that's maybe what makes this so gosh darn confusing, is that for every school out there, there are going to be different aid policies. And there are going to be different aid policies depending upon whether you're a U.S. citizen or a Canadian citizen or permanent resident. So I'm going to posit this whole discussion in research the school you're interested in and find out that school's policies. Even among us in the Ivy League, how we approach Canadian citizens and permanent residents, can vary. But even though you have to go investigate those individual policies, we can still talk to you about some of the words you're going to come across. And I think I introduced earlier need-blind admission versus need-aware admission. And to bring this to life, I'll use Penn as an example. So Penn is need-blind for permanent residents and citizens of North America. So that's Canada, the US, and Mexico. So when we see applications from those areas, we have that citizenship that's been flagged on the application. If I see a Canadian citizen, I am not concerned with whether or not this student has applied for aid. I'm going to focus on everything we just talked about. Test scores, grades, rigor of classes, involvement in the community, essays, so forth. Not concerned with ability to pay. However, there's a big world outside of North America, so Penn is need aware for some of these students. So I keep picking on Brazil for some reason. Let's say you're a Brazilian citizen and you're applying to Penn. We have to be need aware in that case. Students are not just competing for admission in a need-aware environment, they're also competing for funds. So we're not going to admit a student unless we can fund them, but we have to see how much money we have and what an individual student's need is. This is something a school may not be transparent about on their websites or in their literature, but you can ask and they will tell you. So naturally, need blind is desirable, but some schools are going to be need aware because we know that dollars are going to be stretched in lots of different directions when we're trying to meet need. Which leads me to my next piece. You're going to hear schools talk about need-based aid versus merit-based aid. So a great example of need-based aid is all of the Ivy League institutions. We don't put any money towards scholarships. We don't give money because a student has a great GPA. I don't know how we would figure out who gets the merit scholarship. We don't give students money because they're a great soccer player. Rather, we philosophically believe in taking all of our financial aid dollars and giving them to students who require, whether it be $1,000 to $60,000 to come afford our education. We don't want students to say, I cannot attend one of these schools because it costs too much money. So for that reason, because we're meeting need in a case like this, a school that may look like it's a $60,000 price tag, once we take into account all of your financial aid documents, that award, all of a sudden, you could be expected to pay $5,000, and the rest of it's covered by the institution. So don't get too stuck on what that sticker price tag is, because there's a lot of need-based aid out there. There's also a lot of merit-based awards out there. Penn doesn't necessarily grant merit-based aid, but there are schools where you could find resources because you're a great musician and you get financial aid for that, or you get an athletic scholarship. So again, it all depends on where you're applying and what the aid they offer is. Some schools will have a mix of grant and loan in their aid packages. So obviously loan money allows students to borrow and pay back, or parents to borrow and pay back. Grant money is the best because if you get a grant, guess what? You don't have to repay it. I would really like a grant right now if somebody wanted to give me one. Free money you don't have to repay. Again, how a school puts together its aid policy, whether it's all grant financial aid like Penn, whether it's a mix of grant and loan, it's going to depend on the school you're interested in. And that also pertains to whether or not students who are from abroad can get international work study visas to help work on campus and to gain money to contribute towards their education. So this is kind of the philosophical look at what aid is all about. Need-based versus merit aid, need-blind versus need-aware, grants versus loans. JJ is now going to introduce you to more of the nitty-gritty of financial aid.
All right. So thinking about those tools that are available to you, financial aid offices in the States all have websites that are available to you. And of course, Education USA with the Canada branch there in Ottawa and the virtual presence that they've created is going to be something that you can use to make sure that you're getting your financial aid application reviewed holistically with all the pieces there in mind. And then you can start to research whether or not a school forces you to take out a loan as a part of a financial aid package. If they do merit or need-based financial aid, if they have scholarships for certain Canadians that are out there, it's important to do your research so that you are best prepared for when that financial aid package comes to you with your acceptance, so that you know whether or not you can afford a school. But in trying to find out whether or not you should apply to a school, it's important to do that research as well and use the resources available to you. Your university counselor is going to be someone that can help you within this evaluation as well, because they're going to know your history and you may be comfortable sharing more personal information with them just about your finances. And they'll have a historical just memory of your secondary school and where students went and the kind of money that they got with similar situations. U.S. universities do have fee waivers. Depending on your family's financial situation, it may be important to seek out a fee waiver, because we do not want to limit your ability to go on to post-secondary education if finances are a problem or going to be a concern for you. That's why if you look at the College Board, if you look at ETS and the ACT, you may be able to qualify for a fee waiver to take those tests at no cost. And in some schools, in some situations, you'll have an application fee waiver, which means you can apply for free to certain universities. U.S. universities also have net price calculators on their financial aid websites. And honestly, when you think about the way these tools were designed, they were often designed for U.S. citizens in mind. But in some schools, or in some cases, they may have an international net price calculator that you can punch your information into and get an estimate of what your financial aid award may be. But it's important to understand, and hopefully the schools have a disclaimer as to whether or not this net price calculator is going to be translational across into international territory. But it is still there if it's something that can be helpful to you in the process, and if the school has that as a tool for international students specifically. Now, the forms that you have to fill out, many schools will have either an international supplement or an international aid application. Because Penn is need blind for Canadian citizens, we have a separate Canadian aid application. So it's important to look out for any different forms or distinct forms for international students. Some schools will also have these specific forms just to their school. and that's where you put in information that will qualify you for certain scholarships as a part of a merit-based school, or certain or the ability to have different kind of grants come through as a part of a university's financial aid packaging. So those school-specific forms and the specific country or international aid applications are going to be critical if you are applying for financial aid. And then some schools will require the CSS profile that comes from the College Board, and this is where we get a lot of quantitative data, and that's where we also, looking at the tax documents there as the last bullet point in potential forms, that's where we get a lot of the quantitative information that our financial aid offices then use to evaluate what you may have to pay out of pocket. Now, you need to remember, as we've said, that Penn is a university that is need blind for Canadian citizens. Not all U.S. universities are need blind for Canadian citizens. You may be denied in some cases at other schools just because you are an international student, because you're applying for aid and that school does not have the money to fund you. In thinking again about that need-based financial aid, not all U.S. universities exercise need-based aid, but Penn sees it as a priority to have people come to our university dependent on how much their family can afford to pay. And that's why we keep an even playing field with that need-based financial aid policy. Some schools out there in the U.S., some universities do not practice this just because maybe they don't have the resources of Penn, or as a policy, they try to balance their resources as best as possible across their priority constituent groups. And in thinking about Penn and other schools in the Ivy League, if they practice need-based financial aid, maybe they have a huge sticker price and they look very expensive when you're looking at them, but some of these schools may actually cost you the least. They may charge you the least out of pocket to spend to go to those schools. So when you're doing your research, if you see a sticker price of $62,000 of tuition per year, or if you see $48,000 of tuition per year, then it's important to then investigate behind those numbers, because maybe that's a university that is need blind for Canadians, and then one that will practice the need-based packaging or have a merit-based scholarship to make up the difference so that you actually end up paying less out of pocket. So those are some distinct differences that come out of when you compare, say, a U.S. university that has a $62,000 tuition price tag versus a Canadian university that may have a price tag that's much less, but you actually may end up paying less to go to a U.S. university depending on their financial aid policies. So closing out here, it's definitely going to be, it's been a great chat so far. I know that Beth and I have been really going through a lot of questions as you have brought them up in chat. But now I think we can open this up to any other questions that you might have. Feel free to pop them down into the chat box. And if Beth doesn't get to them in the text, or if I don't get to them in the text, then we can announce them out loud for everybody to hear.
Do you want to put our camera back on?
Sure, let's do that.
Oh, sure.
I can
Who doesn't want to see our smiling faces? Okay, how did I do this? Just hit this?
Did we do anything? I don't know. I think Jenica may have done it for us. I don't know. Oh, gosh.
I don't know how that happened, but we're happy to be back.
Great. That's great, Christine. Thank you so much for being on the chat.
So I do see one question.
From Andrea, yeah.
Yeah. What are the legal documents required, and for how long do they take to apply for, and in what order must students get them? Do you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, so in thinking about the legal documents, you're going to have the paperwork for just the U.S. government to be able to say that you are legally able to study in the U.S. Fortunately for Penn, we have an entire international office that's separate from the admissions office that helps with these forms. So I don't know very many of the forms off the top of my head because they deal with that, but I do believe that the I-20 is one that you have to have completed. There are going to be other forms that you may have to fill out depending on the school or the state that you're going into. But it's going to be something that you'll have to research further, because since Penn's fortunate to have that international office, I don't really deal with a lot of those legal kind of document paperwork.
What we can tackle, I'm seeing some questions coming in about converting GPAs and what happens if I didn't do so well in grade 9 and grade 10. So do not recalculate GPAs. You don't need to worry about that for Penn.
Yeah.
You may want to ask the school that your student's applying to, that you're applying to, if they have a preference for that, but I think a lot of the Ivies are not recalculating. For instance, we're going to use the scale that you provide and look at your student within that context. In terms of the individual who asked about grade 9 grades and grade 10 grades, maybe being a little bit softer, I think the key phrase here is, that's okay if you're on an upward trajectory, right? So it's better to have maybe had a softer performance in grade 9, grade 10, and then get stronger and stronger as you go. We would not want to see a downward trajectory, of course. I think, though, in terms of your grades and whether or not you're competitive for admission at a place like Penn, or if you're a better fit for applying to a different type of institution, these are questions you can always bounce off of your school counselor. If he or she is not familiar with a particular institution, and they can call us and we're happy to talk to them. And I'm sure Jenica, sorry Jenica, I'm volunteering you here, could also give you some resources about where you may fall in terms of academic competitiveness in a particular applicant pool. Are there others coming in?
Here we got one. Yeah, so that's a great question, and thinking about the one that's grade 11, if I had a very rigorous program and my grades may have slipped because of that. That's one balance that we're always looking for, and oftentimes, at least us here at Penn, we here at Penn, we see a lot of grade 11 students taking the grade 12 provincial requirements in that grade 11, and we may see some slipping come in those classes, which is something we don't want to see. But if that does happen and you continue into other rigorous work, we at least know that you have the foundation in those subjects, that if you were to come onto our campus, that you have the ability to succeed. We always get the question of, should I take an honors course and get a B, or should I take the regular course and get an A? And we always say you should take the honors course or the AP course and get an A. So hopefully that answers your question. It's not the clearest answer because it always comes down to the other parts of the application and how it all comes together. But we always want to see you taking the more rigorous course and doing well in that rigorous course.
I don't know if Jen is.
Thank you so much.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm going to jump in. I know we could probably sit here and answer questions all day because this has been a very chatty group, and which has been awesome. So what I would like to say is, if you do have more questions, you can feel free to reach out to me for general information. Just a quick overview, Education USA is a free non-partial resource. So you can ask questions about Penn, but I'm here to support overall application questions for any university you're interested in applying to. We do webinars like this where we invite folks from different universities across the US. I'd like to thank JJ and Beth again thank you so much for your help here today. It was fantastic. And it looks like the students and guidance counselors got a lot out of this. I want to remind you that if you are interested in US Study, the US College Expo is this week. I will be at 3 of the 4 locations. I'm not going to be in Calgary, but I'll be in Vancouver, Ottawa, and Toronto. So you can visit me live and in person at the Education USA booth and ask some questions. And then also, of course, seek out other admissions advisors and ask them some of these specific questions that you have been generating. Please follow me on social media and follow JJ and Beth as well. That's a really great way to find out the deadlines you've been asking about, or just overall tips. And we'll go ahead and leave it at that. Thank you so much for coming, and you can just click the X in your upper right-hand corner of your screen to get out of here. Have a great day. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Jenica. Thanks, everybody.